So we're back with Ollie Vargas, who is a Bolivian journalist who's been following the events of the movement towards socialism and their recent blockades against the coup government and the uprising that's happening in Bolivia. Thanks so much for joining us again, Ollie.
No, thanks. Thank you. We had a great discussion last time. I'm sure this one will.
Yeah, so there's a lot to cover, but before we get into it, I was wondering, this just happened as we were recording this morning. The oldest sister, or I guess Evo Morales' only sister, his older sister, Esther Morales, passed away from COVID-19. And I was wondering if you could maybe talk about her. I know that you've posted some information about how she was targeted just for being Evo's sister during the coup, and what she meant to not just Evo Morales, but indigenous Bolivians in general.
Yeah, I mean, the news came in quite early this morning that she had passed away due to complications after getting COVID-19. She already had existing health problems. And like so many Bolivians all across in every region of the country, had to go into a health system that has been allowed to be collapsed, that's been starved, as part of a general COVID-19 strategy based around sort of protecting the interests of private clinics. This is seen, I think, most in the fact that the legislature, in which the MAS has a majority, because it's elected, therefore the MAS is the largest party, they passed a law that would require private clinics to receive COVID-19 patients and treat them free of charge. In fact, the state would pay, sort of cost price of treating these COVID-19 patients, but the private clinics wouldn't actually be profiting from it, even though the costs were covered. And the president, Henry Nanias, has refused, until this moment of recording this, has refused to sign that into law because her government represents elite corporate interests in general, and specifically the coup against Evo Morales was preceded by sort of many months of protests by doctors' associations. I don't want to say unions, I say associations, because you're protesting against the implementation of free universal healthcare that was introduced in January 2019, but which has essentially fallen apart. It was never fully implemented while Evo was in power because it was sabotaged from the moment by these doctor associations who didn't want to lose, clients for their private clinics. And now it more or less doesn't exist at all. And that's how Bolivia went into the COVID-19 crisis. At the same time, Bolivia is one of the few governments in which a growing number of COVID-19 cases, general panic and scaredness about the situation actually is politically beneficial to the government, because then they can use that to say, oh, you shouldn't be out protesting. You could be spreading COVID-19. We can't go to elections because, queuing up with social distancing is, you might still get COVID-19, and that'd be terrible, as if the situation isn't already a disaster, and as if that isn't a reason why there should be elections or why there should be a change of government. So Esther Morales was the victim of that system, of that sort of neoliberal approach in the health sector following the coup. She was an incredibly important person in Evo Morales' personal life. His mother was much older than his father, and she passed away. And she was, Evo always talks about how Esther became his mother. And as they went from Orinoco and Oruro, which is in the sort of Andean highlands, migrating to Argentina, then migrating to the tropical Cochabamba, which is where I am now, and where he became a union leader, and then to the presidency. He's still actually the president of the 6 federations of the Tropical, which is the unions here. And she was there as a mother figure throughout that, incredibly difficult time, migrating from place to place because of poverty, tremendous poverty that saw most of their brothers and sisters die either during childbirth or in the very early years of their life. And but following that, she was never a politician. She never had a job in the state, in the state bureaucracy or anything like that. Unlike Agnes, who all of her family are now a number of different positions. Her daughter is one of the sort of key workers of the Ministry of the Presidency. But Esther Morales never worked in the state. She led a private life. She accompanied everyone on lots of events throughout his presidency. She went abroad with him a few times, but she otherwise kept a private, non-political life. And then just before the coup, when there was a sort of stage of destabilization of the country, right-wing protests, her house was in Oruro, in the city of Oruro, was burnt down by these sort of far-right groups who were leading the protest. That night, they also burnt down the house of the governor of Oruro in the same sort of frenzy. And in different parts of the country, there are a number of other similar attacks as well. And this is an incredibly sad day, obviously, for their family. But also, it's a reminder of how of what happened during the coup. People talking about it, it's not often people talk about it. What really happened during the actual coup? The official media, mainstream media, will talk about how it was, a citizens uprising against Evo Morales. They use the word citizens because social movements, indigenous people, workers, they're not citizens. The citizens are middle class people who, respectable, and all of that. And it was an uprising of those people that got rid of Evo Morales. But actually, there was a number of what really happened was a campaign of destabilization led by these sort of violent, I would say, terrorist groups. And I think these attacks were not the attacks of a frenzied mob, going wild. It was coordinated attacks because they all took place the night before the coup. So Esther Morales' house was burnt down. The governor of Oruro was burnt down. A number of key senior cabinet ministers, their houses were burnt down. In one case, their brother was kidnapped. The offices of the radio station I work at, Kawsashun, were burnt down in the city of Cochabamba. This all happened the same day at roughly the same time. I think these were coordinated attacks to create a situation of chaos. And then a day later, the military comes in and says, we have to bring peace to the country. And the only way to do that is if Evo Morales leaves. And then that's when the coup is consummated, basically.
Right. That's, I mean, that's incredibly important background, especially, the targeting of not just elected officials, but also the targeting of journalists themselves, and basically the gutting of, state media at that particular time. And I think in other places you have written about how the right-wing media really stayed in, in power, in the sense that even under Morales or Evo, in the sense that they were fomenting the opposition, but as the coup was unfolding, they were targeting state-run media, and one of those media outlets was Kawsashun Coca, a local radio station. And I was wondering, the question of media and the question of narrative is incredibly important in this particular history that's unfolding, and that has unfolded since November of last year, as the coup government has taken power, but also a battle over the narrative. And so the claim that the right and the opposition had used of electoral fraud was absolutely, disproven even by, Western media outlets. But nonetheless, it still has the kind of ring of legitimacy for the Agnes government in taking power. And so I was wondering if you could talk about that, and especially when the U.S. Embassy called the coup a, quote, courageous defense of democracy, and how the Western media and Western forces are really obsessed with this idea of a free and open democracy, the free exchange of ideas, but yet never lend any support to media outlets that are considered, state run. You have this crackdown that's happening on Twitter against, outlets, in other countries. They have to identify as state run media outlets, whereas private run for profit media outlets don't have to identify that way. And why it is important for an outlet such as Kawsashun News to be on the ground and reporting on these social movements as they unfold.
Yeah, I mean, before the coup, there was a number of very targeted attacks at media outlets. The case you mentioned of state media being targeted, that was a few days before the coup. Right-wing protesters went to the offices of Bolivia TV, the state TV channel, and sort of forced all of the workers to march out of there. And then from then onwards, there was no there was no official channel. Evo Morales was still in power, but he'd essentially lost control of Bolivia TV, which was the only TV channel that was putting the government's side of the story. The rest of the TV channels in the country, in hyper-partisan right-wing outlets. Then what we saw, like what we suffered at the Radio Kawsashun was then community radio stations being targeted. This was the day before the coup. Our offices were burnt down. Also the radio of the National Campesinos Confederation in La Paz, that was ransacked. The director was taken out and tied to a tree in front of the radio station. And then following that, a number of different sort of smaller community radio stations were closed down. And Kawsashun was never a state media outlet. It was always community radio that was funded through donations by the union members in the Tropic of Cochabamba. Each union member pays 1 Boliviano a month. 1 Boliviano is maybe 20 cents, between 10 and 20 cents a month. And they put that in, and that's what funds the radio station. And that's been the case, while Evo was in government as well. So it's never a state-run outlet. Part of the reason why it still exists today, whereas, the state media channels were obviously taken over by the right when they took power, and now put a very different message. But yeah, there's been an onslaught against alternative media. Following the coup, we faced a number of, attacks, you could say. The frequencies that are owned by the radio that transmit to different regions were taken over by the state, seized and given to other radio stations or to local governments. So the only frequencies that are still left are the local one for this region and in the city of Cochabamba. And even there, the frequency in the city is constantly interrupted whenever there's the news show. So I have a show on the radio at 3 p.m. talking about international news, and the people in the city hear that, no problem. At 7 p.m., when there's the news show, the only newscast in the country that gives, that talks about the news from the perspective of the social movement. At that time, then there's a huge amount of sort of interference. People can't really hear it properly. So that's how they've approached the radio. Our colleague, London Michael, was arrested, in fact, a few months ago while he was reporting on an event by the unions who own the radio station. We've had to operate in that climate. And then when the protests began here, we got information from allied military officers, because there are still military officers who are allies of the social movement, and they leaked this information that there was plans to shut down the radio, plans to arrest the director, and to take over the radio station and use it to emit a pro-government message. So what happened then was the local unions in this area were in the municipality of Chinoca. And so all of the unions came out to block the roads around the station to protect the radio station. And even though the blockade, the roadblocks are lifted now, there's still vigilia, sort of, a vigil around the station of the local unions that come and are ready to protect the radio station in the case of an attack. Because, and I think this speaks to the fact that one of the main reasons we're still going is because of the geographical advantage we have. This is the bastion of the movement towards socialism. And, people are ready to mobilize to protect the radio. Whereas if you're in the cities, it's an incredibly difficult situation. You'll get arrest warrants, you'll get, all sorts of harassment, persecution. But it's something that they haven't yet managed to do against us because they know that there's a sort of buffer zone protecting the physical space of the radio.
And just so I have some other questions about media, and I think I'll ask some at the end of this interview. But if you can, just for our listeners, maybe just give a recap of what has transpired since the coup. I know that MAS has, in many ways, because of the coup, reconstituted itself and has actually, in some ways, strengthened its resolve against the coup government. But nonetheless, there is a growing demand for, open and free and fair elections. MAS has, through a unity pack, has created, or I guess, has elected or put up, I should say, Luis Arce as well as David Chocowenca, not sure if I'm pronouncing his name correctly, as their party's presidential and vice presidential candidates. And so maybe you can walk us through what happened following the coup and then the reconstitution of MAS and pushing for elections, especially presidential elections.
I think that's an interesting question, and it's been sort of changing a lot from the point of the coup to today, various ups and downs. And I think when the coup happened, it was maybe one of the weaker points because the MAS, as I think we talked about on the last podcast, is not a party in the traditional sense, in the fact that you don't go on a website and click join. It's actually a coalition of different social movements, indigenous groups, a former sort of committee that run the party. That link between, I should say, after 14 years in power, there's a number of contradictions will arise, and the link between the social movements and state power was sometimes very good and sometimes not so good. And I think a lot of people talk about a level of sort of demobilization after 14 years in power. So when the coup happened, it was only really the social movements in the city of El Alto and here in the tropic of Cochabamba who fought, till the last moment against the coup. Because in the rest of the country, there had been a level of demobilization, maybe even disillusionment with the government. But they all remained affiliated to the MAS. But after the coup and the outbreak of the sort of racism that hadn't been seen for 14 years, that I think shook social movements all across the country to, renew their ties to the MAS and also strengthen themselves as movements. That's another problem, when you're in power for so long with rising living standards and sort of less social conflict, the unions themselves, they're not going out on strike and protesting every other week. So there's a level of demobilization even within the union. So now we've seen that strengthening. They all went back to the bases, rebuild, reconnect, and the strength of that process of rebuilding unions and the social movements at the sort of rank and file level was seen these past couple of weeks when people rose up in every single region and department of the country. As I said earlier, this wasn't the case after the coup. But for the past 2 weeks, every single region and department, the social movement, mostly in the rural areas, indigenous rural areas, were participating in this behind a demand for elections through which the mass could come to power peacefully, through votes. But I think, following that, obviously there has now been a demobilization, a pause in protest, because the mass managed to pass a law in Congress in which forcing the government to accept October 18th as an immovable date, so they can't delay it anymore. And anyone who tries to delay it will be charged criminally, and to provide the proper amount of funding for the electoral authorities to be able to carry out the election, something that didn't exist before. So then the mass and most of the social movement leaders asked their bases to demobilize. However, the problem was that on the ground, things had radicalized to a much bigger degree. Everywhere I went, personally here in Santa Cruz, people weren't calling for elections, they were calling for the resignation, i.e. the overthrow of the current government immediately. And a minority of social movement leaders were calling for that themselves. So there was a certain split. And then finally, the mass and the Workers' Union Federation, the Central Obrera Boliviana, who organized the whole thing, they called for a demobilization, so that we can get rid of this government the peaceful route through votes. From there, a number of social movements, indigenous groups felt disappointed by this compromise. They were ready to fight all the way, and some of them even talked about a betrayal, and it's a difficult question. It's a difficult question because it's easy to say, it's easy to send other people into fight. But, if you're talking about forcibly overthrowing the government, you're talking about sending people in possibly to die. You have to take responsibility for that. That's what the mass was saying. That our strategy has always been to use every last opportunity to get rid of the government peacefully at the ballot box. But the fact that there was a split shows that this uprising was about a lot more than just the party, about more than the movement for socialism, and more than ever. That there were, people mobilizing around the country out of the desperation, the economic desperation, against the authoritarianism of the current government, and they didn't necessarily identify with Evo Morales. They were doing it for their own struggle and for possibly, dare I say, sort of a new form of political organization, articulation. So there's that kind of tension between the movement and the party, and it's going to be a difficult task for the mass now to reconnect with those movements after having called on them to demobilize. It's a very difficult process, particularly in La Paz. The indigenous groups just outside the city, they were the most radical sections of the movement. They were even sort of collecting arms and weapons, and they talk in very clear terms that this was a betrayal by the mass. So it's going to be a difficult job reconnecting those movements with the party. I mean, I'm sure the mass will have to say that, voting for the mass is the only way to get rid of this current right-wing government. But I think after that, what we might see is a kind of realignment within the indigenous movement in Bolivia. We don't know how that will go, but there certainly will be one.
And can you talk a little bit about the mobilization of the right? Because based on what I've read and what I've seen from your reporting, is that while the right wing, as you mentioned earlier, had mobilized the so-called citizens, right, and the citizens' uprisings against the Evo Morales government, the response of the right in this particular moment, when the blockades were still up before they were demobilized, came about, but it wasn't as strong. It didn't have the same kind of legitimacy, but nonetheless, it was very violent and armed in certain regions. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that and what it looks like on the ground, and if Moss is calling for demobilization, what is happening on the right?
Yeah, so during the protests against Evo Morales, I would say that it did have the characteristics of an uprising insofar as the large majority of the middle and upper class were involved in it. By now, it's not an insignificant number of people. It's a minority, but it's not an insignificant number, and they can mobilize quite a lot of people, citizens, quote unquote, onto the streets. And then what happened was that once these protests began to grow, these sort of armed paramilitary groups came in, sort of camouflaged themselves within the protest, and then carried out extremely violent attacks like the burning down the house of Esteban Morales and lots of other people. But because they came out of this middle class protest movement, they carried with them that momentum as well. And I say this as someone who, very much opposed those protests, but they did have an awful lot of organic momentum. It involved, as I said, the vast majority of the middle and upper class. And having that sort of organic power on the streets gave these paramilitary groups a lot of power. However, now the government was caught in a difficult situation because they've been talking about, it's in their interest to create even more panic, keep people scared about COVID-19. So now the law-abiding middle-class citizens didn't come out on the streets in favor of the government. In fact, most of them don't even believe in the government anymore. Most of them are very critical about the huge amount of corruption, about the economic collapse that's been going on by the current government. So they didn't mobilize. All they had left was these violent paramilitary groups, like in the city of Cochabamba, called the Resistencia Juvenil Cochala, who are basically a group of ex-criminals, gang members, who were brought together and who were given arms by the police. They were taken on police motorbikes to go and attack protesters in the city. The other main group is in the east of the country, in the city of Santa Cruz, the Unión Juvenil Cruceñista. And they're a bit different in that they're not, they're not a bunch of sort of apolitical criminals. They're a very political group going back very many years, many decades, based around quite a traditional fascist ideology. And they were last mobilized in a big way in 2008, 2009, when they led a sort of wave of racial assaults, racial violence against all indigenous people in the city of Santa Cruz. Just the fact of being indigenous was just associated with being a mass supporter and therefore, subject to assault. And those groups were mobilized again this past couple of weeks. They went to the town of Santa Rosa de Roca, outside the city, and they shot 3 people. Fortunately, there's been no deaths so far. A number of people hospitalized with gunshot wounds. And so we've seen these sort of criminal groups emerge again. That's the way that the government wanted to manage the situation. The Minister of Defense, Fernando Lopez, who's from Santa Cruz, he went there and said that, the Unión Juvenil Cruceñista, they know what to do. They need to send a message to Bolivia. So there's a state backing for these groups, but they're not. They don't have the organic power, the organic momentum of the middle upper class protest movement that happened against Evo Morales. I think when we look back at 2008, 2009, WikiLeaks cables, years afterwards, showed that the US government was funneling money to some of these groups through USAID. It was after that that USAID was expelled by Evo Morales. So I'm sure in in a number of years' time, when it's no longer important, we'll find out from declassified US government documents that money was being sent to these sorts of violent groups as well.
In some of the photos that have been released, there's pictures of these right wing groups like wearing flak jackets that look I can't confirm, but they look US made, and they're actually wearing American flags, and
one of them in Cochabamba was wearing a hat with the US flag, a military hat with the US flag, and obviously when I posted that on Twitter, people saying, "Oh, he's a US agent." I don't think he's a US agent because I don't think a US spy would wear a US hat while carrying out an operation.
Right.
But it does speak to their cultural and political affiliations, that that's who they look.
Right, but they were also, armed with explosives and tear gas, and they had like police batons, all kinds of munitions that one would find perhaps on the streets of the United States, used by the police, the police forces here. And so it was a curious kind of I guess occurrence, and like you said, we may find out years from now what that actually means in the long term. But I wanted to also ask about the elections themselves. And you said that the Moss had secured legislation that the elections would go forward on October 18th, and this was part of the demobilization process. But also uh, the Moss candidates, Luis Arce, they're polling incredibly high, far beyond, like, 20 points in some instances beyond the opposition candidates. And part of the reason why they were trying to not have elections, citing fears around COVID-19, was the simple fact that the coup government couldn't win in a democratic election. But can you talk about who the Moss candidates are and their popularity amongst not just Moss supporters, but the social movements themselves and the broader electorate?
Yeah, so I think recent poll by think tank Stellag showed that Luis Arce is on 41% of the vote. Carlos Mesa was 27, 28% of the vote in second place. And then Agnes, the president, is on about 13%. A distant threat even compared to second place. So I think there's an interesting process actually, because just after the coup, Agnes had quite a large base of support amongst those middle class groups that I talked about earlier. But with the sort of economic collapse that's happened, as a result of sort of neoliberal reform, that support has completely dissolved. But while she was riding high, her chief advisor was a man named Eric Ferranda, who'd been seconded from the US Embassy. He worked at the US Embassy in Bolivia for 25 years, so long before Evo Morales even came onto the scene. And she brought him in as her sort of chief secretary. And I think what happened was that he sold her to the United States, insofar as like he, went to the State Department and said, "She's the one we need to back. She has support amongst a wide base of middle class people who hate Evo Morales, who hate the mass, and think it's a wonderful thing that she sort of burst onto the scene and took power. So we should sort of move to support her, encourage her to run as a candidate, because she wasn't supposed to run as a candidate. She talked constantly about how she had no political ambitions, and that's why she was so great." So then we saw her declare candidacy. That was another moment in which the middle class sort of lost their illusions in her a little bit. And now what we've seen with the economic collapse is her popularity just sort of be destroyed. So now the candidate that the US was going for has been taken out. They're going to have to go back to the candidate they supported at the last election, which is Carlos Mesa, which is, who's an ex-president, ex-vice president, who, worked with the US for a very long time, but who the US had sort of pushed aside because they thought he was yesterday's news. But he's now the only sort of credible candidate left of the right. That speaks to the weakness of the right, that they can't bring new figures, they can't bring new faces. They're just recycling the people that were actually overthrown in 2003 and 2005. So that's the sort of electoral weakness of the right. On the left, there's only one left-wing candidate at this election, which is the movement towards socialism. And as I talked about earlier, there was, especially after the coup, there's been a process of realignment of social movements, other leftists coming back into the fold of the mass. And there was I think a lot of energy behind the campaign for Luis Arce, even people who were being very critical of the mass were talking about how, this is the only way that we're going to be able to get rid of this government that's sort of destroyed everything in such little time. But again, as I said earlier, there's now sort of internal conflict, certainly, between some sections of the movement in the past. So where do they have support? I think the uprising tells us where the mass has support. So the uprising covered almost 100% of the country's rural areas. That's about 30% of the country. And Evo Morales at the last election got about just over 80% of the vote in the rural areas of the country. I think that's going to increase because there's a number of rural areas that had sort of local disputes with the last government, but who have now become very energized in the movement against the current government. So I think those sections are going to come back into the mass, and we're going to see a vote for the mass in the rural areas at about 90%. And as I say, in Bolivia, rural areas means indigenous areas. Almost all of Bolivia's rural areas are indigenous communities. That's about 30% of the population. In the cities, it's been more difficult for the mass because that's where you have the mainstream media. People in the cities, what do they do? How do they consume media? They read newspapers, they watch TV, and that's where you've seen an incredibly coordinated campaign from 100%. Now that we don't have the state media, it's now 100% of the media talking every day in a campaign against the mass. That's how the people in the cities consume information. Whereas in the rural areas, people don't watch it. You can't even buy newspapers in the rural areas. People listen to their community radio stations that are allied to the mass. So that plays a big role. But nevertheless, throughout this quarantine, throughout this sort of lockdown because of COVID-19, it's been the people in the cities who've suffered the most. Working class people in the cities. Because in Bolivia, like most of Latin America, a big majority of working class people in urban areas work in the informal economy. And with the quarantine, with the total lockdown, extreme total lockdown measures, those people couldn't go to work. The state doesn't provide them with any income support. The current regime didn't provide them with any income support. So those sectors are now incredibly angry at the current government. So during this past uprising, the urban areas that joined the protest was the city of El Alto, the south side of the city of Cochabamba, and the district of Plan 3000 in Santa Cruz. And it falls along class lines. I think if you looked at it as well, it also falls along racial lines. But the main reason for which a growing number of people in the city are going to vote for the mass is because of the economic collapse and because those sectors as a class have been left with nothing, have been told that you can't go to work. You have to stay in your home with, maybe 4 children, 5 children in your 1-bedroom house, and you can't leave. And, if you go to work, it means you're an ignorant person who doesn't understand the severity of this crisis. And but we're also not going to provide you with any sort of income support, any sort of furlough pay, subsidy payments. So there's a huge amount of resentment among people that were never, party affiliated, weren't necessarily pro-mass, but are now, just so ready to get rid of the current government.
And, right before the uprising happened, I think it began on around July 27th. But just days before that, Elon Musk, who is the CEO of Tesla, he tweeted out something really fascinating, saying, in response to, a tweet about whether the U.S. government should create a stimulus package for the American people. He responded, somebody said, it wasn't in the best interest of the people, the U.S. government organizing a coup against Evo Morales in Bolivia, so you could obtain the lithium there. And then he responded to that person saying, we will coup whoever we want, deal with it.
Yeah.
And, normally, like you said earlier, normally it takes years to, really get at the the smoking guns, I should say, for the reasons behind these coups. And oftentimes, in the Western media, these things get framed as like a struggle over democracy. These are popular uprisings, et cetera, et cetera. And if you point to the economic factor, you're often called this. Somebody actually called me this. Uh, they said I'm a vulgar anti-imperialist, whatever that means, for
Vulgar
suggesting.
Marxism.
Yeah, I think it's a play on that. But it was in some ways it was a smoking tweet, to say that. And what you were describing is that for years Morales and Mas fought to redistribute the wealth of Bolivia for Bolivian people. And under the coup government, we basically see the inability of the coup regime to actually just provide for people's basic needs. But at the end of the day, it is a question of geopolitics and a question of economics, that one government and one not political party, but a movement, to say, can provide or wants to provide for the needs of the people, and the other can't, because it's going back to it's trying to revert back to that old kind of colonialist extractivist model. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the question of lithium and the suspension of democracy, and what because that's looming large in these conversations. You won't really read about it, I should say, in the Western press, but nonetheless it is looming large in the larger question of the future of Bolivia, not so much determined by the Bolivian people, but determined by these corporate interests such as Tesla, and what their relationship will be in exploiting that particular natural resource.
Yeah, I mean, to not be called a vulgar Marxist, I would say obviously the coup had a number of different factors, especially local factors from the oligarchy, the middle and upper class feeling incredibly resentful that they were being ruled over by, an indigenous person who hadn't even finished school. And so those sorts of class and racial resentment were the main mobilizing factor in destabilizing the country before the coup. But you know, I would also say that lithium was part of it. Lithium played an incredibly important role uh, in the timing of the coup. And you just have to look at the facts of how the situation in Bolivia's lithium industry has evolved. 1 month before the coup, the state lithium company, YLB, unveils its first domestically produced electric car. And I know that because I used to work at Telesur English at that time, and I wrote the article when the news first came out on October the 2nd. It was, and then 20 days later, you have a sudden sort of level of destabilization. But in fact, long before that, right-wing groups, one of the main coup leaders, street movement leaders in favor of the coup, was a guy called Marco Fumari in the region of Potosi, which is where the lithium is based. And he'd been protesting long before the elections about the issue of lithium. And he was trying to portray the contract that Evo Morales' government had with a German company as somehow bad, trying to sort of destabilize that contract. In reality, that contract was an incredibly beneficial contract in which the Bolivian state company would have total control of the raw extraction of the resource. And then in the process of industrialization, which I say this is incredibly important because Bolivia wasn't, under Evo Morales, wasn't planning to just send off this natural resource as a cheap raw material. It was planning to industrialize it and produce value-added products like batteries, like electric cars, within the country, in state factories. And they've begun to do that. But obviously that's an incredibly costly process. And it requires a lot of sort of expertise and knowledge that you don't necessarily have in Bolivia. So they brought in a German company that would have a minority share in the industrialization process to provide the investment and some of the sort of technical knowledge and expertise. As I said, at every stage of this process, the Bolivian state company had majority control.
There was also a Chinese consortium that was chosen to be a strategic partner in this new venture, and they had invested, I believe, around like $2.3 billion within the lithium projects. And this is something that I think is incredibly important, not just for Bolivia, but what's happening in the world today, because as the United States declines as a superpower, it simply doesn't have the it never had the moral legitimacy, but it doesn't have the kind of economic power it once did to just tell countries that your only partner can be us, because China represents an alternative. And in some ways, like there is not I'm not saying this is the case, but in some ways Bolivia for the United States was a proxy war in its perceived Cold War against China as an economic superpower. And that's, I mean, just
Yeah,
reading
absolutely.
tea leaves, I guess.
No, 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 absolutely. And, you know, for better or worse, China, is a country that wants to do business around the world, but that doesn't try and impose on internal policies of countries. So China does a number of investments in the initial early stages of extraction. Chinese are providing investment, again, under the management of Bolivia State Company. Now, I don't think there's anywhere in the world where the US accepts the position where the US government allows its oil companies or whatever to take a minority role in the extraction of a certain resource. They always demand control because the point for them isn't about making money; it's about control and geopolitical control. All the rest of it. Whereas China, Germany as well, was coming in as a business partner. Rather than looking to control. I think that's incredibly important. And so what I want to go to now is what happened after the coup. I think this has everything to do with that. After the coup, that contract was completely cancelled. And now the entire process that was already beginning to function of producing value-added products using lithium is now paralyzed. Those factories, their gates are closed. There's nothing going on there. The workers have been fired. No production. Why? If there was already a level of economic movement in that regard, why has production been completely paralyzed? It's been paralyzed because the US is not happy with a setup in which, these foreign companies are allowed to come in and make a bit of money but not have majority control. They want to paralyze the process so as to restart it under their own control. And we saw that when the Minister of the Economy went to university in Santa Cruz, sort of, talk about the economic post-COVID-19 economic recovery. And he talked about the fact that, look, we're going to have to invite a number of foreign companies now in to produce the lithium. He didn't talk about whether they're going to still industrialize it in Bolivia. So, I've spoken to union leaders from that region in Potosí, in South Potosí, in the town of Uyuni especially. And they say that, what's going to happen is that they're going to come in, foreign companies like Tesla or, God knows who else is going to come in, take control of the process of extraction, and then take it abroad, industrialize it elsewhere. There already, in countries like Australia, wherever, there already exist factories that can produce these value-added products. They just need the raw material. So it's much cheaper for a foreign company to take Bolivia's lithium and take it to their own factory in another country than it is to build factories from scratch capable of doing this sort of quite complex process. So then Bolivia loses all of the income that it was supposed to get through selling batteries and electric cars and things. So it's all of this that's perfectly aligned for natural resources to spill out the hands of Bolivians, just as a government that believes in controlling natural resources has been kicked out of power by the military and by the US embassy. So I don't think it's a conspiracy theory or being vulgar Marxism to state the sequence of events. The sequence of events being Bolivia was producing lithium in state factories, US-backed coup happens, that production is paralyzed.
I guess to be a I guess to be a vulgar Marxist, Marx would just call that the law of value, that it's not profitable to invest locally, but to realize those profits elsewhere by extracting and then, creating, certain supply chains where the value is realized elsewhere.
Of
And
course.
that's the point. I mean, like, this is when I talk to friends and colleagues about this, they always, they go back to, and this gets to my final question, but they always go back, a lot of them go back to, well, didn't, Evo Morales do this? Wasn't he against the environment? Wasn't he, an industrialist and this and this? And, when I found out in 2013 that Bolivia launched a satellite named after an indigenous revolutionary, Tupac Katari, I was so proud. But everyone around me was like, well, that's just industrial civilization. And I was like, what do you mean? This is like a great monumental achievement for an indigenous nation, indigenous people, like, but as indigenous people, we're not allowed to live in the future. We're not even allowed to enter the stage of history where, we can build our own economies that, meet the needs of our own people. And one of the things that always was really profound, for me as somebody who considers himself on the left, but also somebody who considers themselves part of a climate justice movement, whatever that means, is that in 2010, I was influenced by, I was inspired by the Cochabamba Accords, the People's Accords. And one of the things in those accords that I learned about, as far as the relationship between the global north and the global south, and especially like a country like Bolivia, is that there actually has to be, for there to be a quote unquote just transition away from extractive, fossil fuel economies, there actually has to be a technology transfer, right? The fact that the United States, since, or prior to 2019, I think China's overtaken them in as far as patents, holds the majority or has a monopoly on the patents and the technology to actually produce renewable resources such as rechargeable batteries, is directly related to the economic imperialism of, the United States and the way it behaves in the world. And so when we talk about, this may be beyond, the conversation that we're having, but when a lot of folks talk about the Green New Deal in the US, and it's like, the Green New Deal for who? Like
Yeah.
for Westerners to maintain their level of consumption and exploitation of countries like Bolivia, that's not justice. And I guess, where I'm going with this is kind of a multi-part question, but where I'm going with this is that it's fashionable in the North to take a third camp approach, to say, I oppose the coup, but neither Mas or neither the golpistas, as if that's an option for people, as if that's like, and even as if that's, people on the ground really care what people in the United States think, or as if, that opinion matters. And oftentimes people will pick a side, like they'll pick like the anarchist collective called Mujeres Creando, for example, to say, well, this represents the real will of the people, and we're going to support this, and we're just going to ignore, the trade unions, we're going to ignore the social movements, and just say, like, and that's not to like gloss over the contradictions that exist in these, very complicated political processes, but there's a tendency to really simplify or reduce what are complicated problems to like a third camp approach, that one can choose like a pure path. And that's not what is at stake. And especially it's not at stake when we talk about things like climate change. And so I guess with closing out this conversation, I would love to hear your thoughts on that, and like how these so-called leftists in the North, map their own ideas onto these movements, and in some ways, they take this third camp approach. And what does that mean? What does that mean on the ground for people who are actually fighting for their lives in Bolivia?
Yeah. Well, actually, just to start with the issue first, right at the beginning of the satellite. That satellite was actually was able to launch into space thanks to investment from China, but it's under Bolivia's control completely. Bolivia paid uh, some Chinese companies to help provide the expertise to be able to launch it, but it's under the control of the Bolivian state. I think that speaks to how China actually engages with the world, with countries like Bolivia, um, and now that satellite provides internet to the whole country. Before that satellite was launched, you can get any phone. You wouldn't even be able to make a phone call outside of the big cities.
So
And
we're
now in all of
speaking
the rural areas,
we're speaking
Yeah, we're
over that
speaking. Yeah,
satellite. That's amazing.
absolutely. I'm in the village right now, Laucaenye, in the municipality of Chinaltam, but we're not in the main town. We're in a relatively small village right now, and places like this had zero, let alone data. Didn't even have phone signal, and now they all have data. And I'm sure the connection may not be perfect, but it's good enough to sort of go about your daily life and be connected to your country and to the world. And that's the point. It gives people in rural areas, indigenous communities, the power to be able to connect all around the world. The issue of extractivism is obviously incredibly, complex one, but at a basic level, you have to remember, you know, if a left-wing government comes in to Bolivia tomorrow, they, they can't just simply create a universal health system of top quality and top quality schools and all the rest of it. Not because of lack of political will, but because of lack of resources. Where does the state get money from? They can't take it. You don't get resources to do all that stuff from general taxation, because in the global south, who pays tax? The amount of tax you take from the rich people are relatively few in number, and they're not even that rich compared to rich people in the global north. And then, among the general population, a large section, even a majority in a lot of places, work in the informal economy. So the state isn't getting taxes from that. If someone goes and sells food on the street, the state you aren't paying tax for the transaction that's been made. That money isn't going to the state. The income that the person selling that food isn't going to the state because it's informal. So where is the state supposed to get money to build public services that can provide a dignified life for a majority of people? Well, in Bolivia, the answer to that is to have control. The only answer is to have control of your natural resources that are in the country and be able to, engage with the global market on the basis that can bring revenue to the state, which can then be used to alleviate poverty and also to invest in other areas of the economy, diversify the economy. So for all the infrastructure that exists in Bolivia right now, outside the big cities, was all built under Evo Morales' government. It was only possible because of the income that the country got from nationalizing natural gas. Where else are you going to get money from? The IMF isn't going to give you money for that. They might give you a few million to pay off debts to someone else, but they're not going to give you the amount of money required to develop your economy, build infrastructure in a way that's beneficial to your country. So the only way to do that is, if you have the natural resources, to be able to have control of them, and benefit your own population. I think everyone in Bolivia, the previous government as well, always had a vision that the country isn't going to be dependent on natural resources forever. We have to support other areas of the economy. But how do you do that if you don't have any money? You have to have money to be able to do that. And the only way for a global South government to raise money is through having control of its natural resources. So it's easy to say, from the United States, in your apartment with Wi-Fi and a working toilet, to be able to say, oh, why are they taking gas out of the ground? Shouldn't you keep it in the ground? Well, if that gas is under public democratic control, that will go to build bathrooms, roads, hospitals for people in areas like the one I'm talking to you from now.
I think that's an incredibly important point, and I think that's, at least in my estimation, just listening to you talk and reading and following what's happening, this is going to be the question of the future, and it's going to determine the path that Bolivia can take. And I just hope that people who are listening to this podcast and engaging your work really take that into consideration, that these aren't pie in the sky abstract ideas. These are people's lives, and you are confronted when any kind of social movement, any kind of government takes power, they are confronted with that. How do you feed people? How do you take care of them? And of course there's going to be contradictions that arise, but it's how those governments and those movements work through them and develop them if they're given a chance. But as we know, because of US imperialism and Western intervention, a lot of these movements are blamed for their failures as if they collapsed on their own internal contradictions. And we always have to remember, the enemy, which is in this case, it's imperialism is operating, in the backgrounds, and we don't know to what extent quite yet what that looks like, but we do know that that pressure is real, and that the advances that a movement can make are often hindered by and determined by the the threat, the looming threat of intervention. And as we see this wane, the United States empire, as we see it wane, we can only look to places like Bolivia for guidance and answers in the way that they're dealing with these issues, especially as indigenous people who are in the north. And so I really appreciate you taking the time, Ollie, to talk to us. And before we go, I just want to plug, and I'll drop it in the show notes, but I want to plug your Patreon account, Kawsashun News. Support them, support the media that they're producing. And where can folks find your media and your work? And what other ways can they support?
Yeah, thanks. I work at Radio Kawsashun Kokam, which is owned by the unions here. And then from that basis, we launched a page in English called Kawsashun News. And yeah, as you said, we have a Patreon, we're on Twitter, on Facebook. We're going to be launching a website for news articles, analysis articles in the coming weeks. Keep an eye out for that. But yeah, people always ask me, how can we support Bolivia, from the UK or from the US or from wherever. And I think, the most important way is to not let people forget about what's going on, and to learn the lessons of what's going on. I think Bolivia is of importance not just to Bolivians, but to people around the world, because this is what happens when the US intervenes in the country. You get persecution, you get, an explosion of racism, you get economic collapse through neoliberalism. I think those lessons can be taken from Bolivia, and are useful for people around the world.
Thanks so much, Ollie.
Thank you for having me on.